Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Rebuttal podcast, where we break down case law, calamity, and chaos in the legal field. I am once again your host, Reb Maisel, and today is an episode that is very special and near and dear to me because we are going to highlight a reality in the legal field and a cause that I feel very passionately about and just so badly want to scream from the rooftops in order to spur some real change and reform, and also absolutely spread the word to law students and lawyers and people who are interested in joining the legal field that there are so many opportunities in one specific area that can seriously change lives. One area that is overlooked that a lot of people just don't know about is the area of immigration law, specifically where unaccompanied minors are left in the dark, forced to represent themselves in court. It is not an over-exaggeration. It is not an illusion. It is not painting a too aggressive picture. It is the picture. And today we are going to learn about it. We are going to see it, and we are going to get the word out because, God, do we need more lawyers to help these kids out. Content warning for this episode. It involves children, the stories of real children in traumatic situations, both abroad and in our country. So please be advised and take care of yourselves. Here we go. To illuminate this issue and get into the nitty-gritty of why these children are left so alone, we are going to start with, as always, a story. Guillermo's family home sat on a hill in San Salvador. The houses there stood crowded, stacked one upon another with rusted metal roofs, and some nights Guillermo could stand atop the hill and look across the valley of dark buildings to the bright incandescence of Estadio Cuscatlan, Central America's largest soccer stadium. Between him and the stadium ran a busy street. His side of the street was controlled by the gang MS-13. On the other side, the rival gang, Barrio 18, controlled its own territory. One night in the winter of 2013, Guillermo, then 15, walked outside with friends as it rained. He heard a car's tires slowing as it splashed through the puddles until it stopped beside him. A Barrio 18 gangster fired from the window. Guillermo ducked behind a parked truck. His friend dove into a cardboard box. Guillermo and his friend were fine, but a young father who had stepped outside to make a call was shot in the stomach. The father ran across the street to a nearby hospital, but he died the next day. By that time, the gangs had already shot Guillermo's father in the chest. They had forced his brother-in-law to his knees and shot him in the head. Both had survived, though his father had lost a lung, and for a year, his brother-in-law had carried a bullet in his skull. At night, Guillermo saw the rising body count on the news. At school, he heard from friends of how the gangs tried to recruit them. On July 1st, 2014, Guillermo was forced to flee El Salvador, fleeing for his life. Almost 2,000 miles, and 1 week later, he floated across the Rio Grande on an inflatable raft. When he arrived in the United States, he was one of 68,540 other unaccompanied children to do so that year. I repeat, children to do so that year. It was an unprecedented spike in the number of children who made the often deadly journey north. 3 years earlier, in 2011, the number had been just 16,000. As an unaccompanied child, Guillermo was not entitled to legal counsel. I repeat, as an unaccompanied child, Guillermo did not have a right to legal counsel. Like all other unaccompanied children without the resources or guardians to provide legal representation in their immigration proceedings, he was forced to represent himself in court. A child who had been through countless traumatizing situations, including his journey to the U.S. itself, with no legal training, background, or guidance, much less any knowledge on how to navigate the complex immigration system in our country. Lawyers need to go through their own training to even understand how to work through it. Lawyers, trained lawyers. And this is a child. This is the reality. And it is not new. It's been going on for decades. Fast forward to today, 2024. It has been over a decade since Guillermo's crossing into the U.S. as an unaccompanied child, and the rule is still the same. This is America. Each year, thousands of immigrant children are placed into court proceedings in which government prosecutors seek to deport them unless those children can prove that they have a right to stay in the United States. While the United States government may provide pillows and booster seats for children who are too small for the chairs in immigration court, the government does not have to give them an attorney to protect their rights. The Sixth Amendment guarantees lawyers for the accused in all criminal prosecutions, but those protections do not apply to people facing deportation, which is considered a, quote, civil proceeding, despite the fact that the outcome of these deportation proceedings is quite literally life or death. If these children many times are sent back to their home countries, they will die or worse. They fled for their lives once, for a reason. And yet, this is considered a civil proceeding in which they are not entitled to, at the very least, an attorney who can understand this system and advocate legally for their right to stay in the United States. Because what they are doing is legal. In order to even have a claim for asylum in the United States, which is a legal proceeding, a proper legal proceeding, you must physically be present in the U.S. You cannot mail in an application. There's no online form. There's no Zoom. You have to physically be here. So for those who even at the beginning of this episode think, well, they could just do it legally, this is quite literally the legal way. If they had called up a lawyer, if these children, a 5-year-old, 6-year-old, 8-year-old, 15-year-old child had called up a lawyer and asked, hey, how do I seek asylum? How do I flee from this devastating situation and seek asylum in the U.S.? A legal concept, a legal principle that has been internationally recognized since the Holocaust, on an international scale, on a global scale, and in the U.S. How can I do that? The lawyer would say, well, you have to get here. You have to physically be here. Although immigrant children facing deportation have the right to hire an attorney, they are not provided with one if they or their families cannot afford to hire one. As a result, children end up in complex adversarial legal proceedings with no one to protect their rights. Some of you build the wallers might be thinking, well, what rights does an undocumented, unaccompanied child really have in the U.S.? Oh, baby, there are many. There are many because we are a nation of rights and freedoms. And a nation of immigrants, mind you. The United States offers a number of legal protections for children who may face dangers to their life, liberty, and well-being in their home countries. Special Immigrant Juvenile Status, SIJS, for example, is a legal protection for children who have been abused, abandoned, or neglected. The U.S. government can also grant asylum to those fleeing persecution in their home countries. There are also specific protections for survivors of crime or human trafficking. Yet, without an attorney, these children, from literal babies to teenagers, more likely than not do not know their rights or the legal actions they can take for them to remain in the country. These children may only be unaccompanied, quote unquote, because they entered the United States without a parent or legal guardian or were separated with them at some point. Or they may have different immigration claims from their parent or legal guardian, which means that they are separated for proceeding purposes. Unaccompanied children with legal representation are more than 7 times more likely to receive an outcome that allows them to remain in the country. I repeat, 7 times more likely. And it's not because that the children who stumble upon lawyers or somehow find pro bono representation or somehow can afford a lawyer, they have stronger claims. Oh, no. The strength of an unaccompanied child's claim for staying in the U.S. oftentimes, unfortunately, has very little bearing on whether they are deported, because oftentimes if they do not have legal representation, but they have the strongest case on paper, they can't advocate for themselves. So they are deported. Do you see how backwards this is? For many children, deportation means returning to life-threatening conditions, period. It is so difficult to prove an immigration case without a lawyer that regardless of the strength of their immigration claims, from 2005 to 2017, more than 90% of unaccompanied, unrepresented children were issued an order of removal or voluntary departure. Legal representation makes all the difference. Yet, they do not have the constitutional right, the legal right to counsel. The same way that if they were a criminal defendant, regardless of whether you're a citizen or not, the Sixth Amendment right to counsel attaches and applies. A public defender will be appointed, right? Everyone knows the Miranda rights. If you cannot afford an attorney, one will be provided for you. Why? Because we have the right to that in criminal proceedings. We do not have the right to that, the absolute right, constitutional right to that, in civil proceedings. And for whatever reason, it is considered a civil proceeding. So they do not, at the very least, have the dignity of a lawyer. Regardless of how you feel about immigration, border control, border patrol, it doesn't matter whether you're red or blue or anywhere in between. If you genuinely believe that unaccompanied children should be required to sit in a booster seat in court and advocate legal claims for themselves, you're out of your mind. That's not a fair system of justice. That's no justice at all. Even if the outcome means that they do not get to stay in this country, the dignity of having a lawyer there and having the right to have a lawyer present the best case that you have, which often for these children, they squarely fall under our United States laws as being permitted to seek asylum and actually be granted asylum and be able to stay here. It's a no-brainer, but our system is the way it is, which is not okay, and we should not leave it at that, and that's why this episode exists. In 2023, nearly half of all unaccompanied children in immigration proceedings had no legal representation. Nearly half were treated just like this. Children forced to be lawyers for a day, or maybe even more, after being detained from the start of their case to the end, expected to defend themselves and answer questions in court and listen to an interpreter through 2 large headphones as the prosecutor puts on their case to deport them. That is barely better than flipping a coin. Unfortunately, representation is not guaranteed and in short supply. There is only one free or low-cost immigration lawyer for every 78 unaccompanied children with pending immigration cases. And that is if every lawyer fitting that description is available, represents children, and can take on new cases, which just isn't the reality. With over 100,000 new unaccompanied children arriving each year, the demand is only going to grow. But what makes them a, quote, unaccompanied child? The Acacia Center for Justice is a nonprofit organization that expands and advocates for meaningful access to justice and freedom for immigrants at risk of detention or deportation. And centers like the Acacia Center for Justice know all too well, what does this look like? What does this mean? What does everyone, the American people, need to know about the way our immigration system is currently working and how we can help? Well, let's start here. Legally, an unaccompanied child, quote unquote, is defined as those younger than 18 without lawful immigration status who have no parent or legal guardian in the country available to provide care and custody. Unaccompanied children representing themselves in immigration court is the reality that transpires one step after family separation at the border. In 2018, stories of unaccompanied children representing themselves pro se in immigration court garnered significant media attention, typified by images of toddlers sitting alone before a judge, peering over the defendant table in courtrooms. Former Assistant Chief Immigration Judge Jack Well went viral when he announced that he could teach immigration law to 3- and 4-year-old children. In response, an immigration attorney recorded attempts to explain the litigation process in immigration courts to children of that age. The videos that resulted captured one toddler replying, quote, "Yeah, I like my balloon," in response to, quote, "Is English your native language?" In another snippet, a different child requested that their country of removal be designated as pizza. In a segment for Last Week Tonight, John Oliver unpacked how throughout the country, a 2-year-old cannot go into a bouncy castle unsupervised, but these children were somehow required to represent themselves in immigration court. The punchline for the bouncy castle comparison landed, with Oliver's studio audience erupting in laughter. Even though the notion of toddlers representing themselves seems so obviously absurd, this has been and continues to be the reality. It's funny for a punchline, but it's not funny when you see it. The volume of outstanding cases within the U.S. immigration system is hard to comprehend, even after taking a close look at the numbers. That said, an evaluation of the data is essential for understanding why allowing unaccompanied children to represent themselves in life-altering proceedings continues to be the status quo. According to the TRAC, the Transactional Records Access Clearinghouse, at the end of July 2024, there were 3.7 million active cases pending before the immigration court. According to the Executive Office for Immigration Review, EOIR, there were approximately 2.5 million pending cases at the end of fiscal year 2023. According to the TRAC, in December 2023, immigration judges averaged 4,500 pending cases each. While the Supreme Court has not firmly decided whether minors, children, have the right to representation in immigration court specifically, courts of appeal have issued decisions in cases that posed this question. In a Sixth Circuit case in 2020, United States versus Sylvester Gregorio, the court held that in immigration court, quote, "there is no constitutional right to a government-appointed counsel, regardless of age." The court says this is because the other requirements, aka the holding a hearing, developing a record, providing an interpreter, and explaining the rule of law already satisfy due process, and that the, quote, "risk of error in removal proceedings," i.e. the risk that a person is wrongfully deported, does not invariably depend on that person having a thorough understanding of immigration law, end quote, which is insanity. That's incorrect. It's just wrong. You see, I've told you the numbers. Unaccompanied children with legal representation have 7 times more likely of a chance of obtaining an outcome where they get to stay in the United States. So yeah, it actually does depend on that, regardless of the strength of their case. But in other words, according to the Sixth Circuit in 2020, it doesn't matter if a child understands anything about immigration law because the immigration judge will make sure it is fair. I'm sure. The other really frustrating thing about this case is that it basically rejects its own precedent in applying this mildly arbitrary rule, saying, oh, you don't need an attorney in immigration court. I mean, imagine if in criminal court we were saying the same thing. Oh, you don't need an attorney. Just like argue your case. You'll be fine, right? Like there's a reason why lawyers exist. There's a reason why the Sixth Amendment right to counsel exists. It rejects, the Sixth Circuit rejects in this holding in 2020 its own damn precedent. Okay, this previous case, and mind you, the use of the term alien was used in this case. It's just a direct quote. It's not my words. All right. This is a case from 1975. Quote, "Where an unrepresented indigent alien would require counsel to present his position adequately to an immigration judge, he must be provided with a lawyer at the government's expense." Quote unquote. That is Enriquez versus Immigration and Naturalization Services in the Sixth Circuit in 1975. But the court in the 2020 case just dismisses this. It says, oh, no. Okay, perfect. In JEFM versus Lynch, a Ninth Circuit case from 2016, the American Civil Liberties Union, the ACLU, worked with other civil rights groups and law firms to organize a class action targeted at the specific issue of representation for non-citizen children. The court briefly discussed that pro bono attorneys are, quote, already more than stretched to compensate for the lack of representation. However, the Ninth Circuit ultimately dodged the question put forth by the class action because of jurisdictional technicalities. But the Ninth Circuit would briefly touch on this issue again in CJLG versus Barr in 2019. In that case, the court granted an appeal because an immigration judge failed to inform an unrepresented child about his eligibility for certain relief, but declined to address the child's claim that he had a constitutional right to appointed counsel. 3 judges concurred, but wrote separately to emphasize that the failure to provide non-citizen children with representation in immigration court is a, quote, mockery of judicial and administrative processes, end quote. The concurrence raised many points to analyze this right, including statistics of unaccompanied children in immigration proceedings, the loss of liberty, the risk for error, the complexity of immigration law, the shortcomings of current protocols, and the burden on the government. The following quote from that concurring opinion captures the irony that persists in today's immigration system. Quote, "The importance of counsel, particularly in asylum cases where the law is complex and developing, can neither be overemphasized nor ignored. If an attorney's failure to investigate and research her child client's case can be a Fifth Amendment violation, then how can a child without any counsel have a proceeding that comports with due process?" It is absurd to think that a child who has an attorney, right, who was lucky enough to either afford one or to have pro bono counsel that they found, okay, a child who has that attorney can absolutely have their rights violated if that attorney fails to provide competent assistance. Malpractice, right? But their rights would not be violated at all in the same system if they have no attorney at all. Make it make sense. It doesn't. And the court, thankfully, at the very least, points this out and says, yeah, so that's hypocritical and bonkers, don't you think? And we do think, but that opinion, unfortunately, was a concurring one and did not have any real impact on what the rule still is today. It is helpful to highlight the true disparity in our treatment of children, minors, in immigration court versus juvenile court. On the whole, there has been a lack of attention directed towards remedying the current system for minors navigating immigration courts. However, juvenile courts are a very different story. The existence of juvenile courts within the U.S. criminal legal system demonstrates a recognition that cases involving children require special care and tailored protocols. In contrast, immigration courts adjudicate cases for both adults and children. Some immigration courts have created juvenile dockets, which separate cases that involved unaccompanied children from the broader docket in a way that loosely simulates how the judiciary splits juvenile court and adult legal proceedings. But the rationale behind juvenile dockets in immigration court is to encourage child-friendly courtroom practices and, quote, promote consistency. Advocates have praised juvenile dockets as an effective way to improve immigration courts for non-citizen minors, children, but this system is not currently built into the fundamental structure of immigration courts, obviously. Turning to legal representation for minors, the Supreme Court formally gave all children the constitutional right to counsel in the landmark case in Rebuttal. When explaining the importance of this constitutional protection, the court acknowledged that children need such legal aid. Quote, "The juvenile needs the assistance of counsel to cope with problems of law, to make skilled inquiry into the facts, to insist upon regularity of the proceedings, and to ascertain whether he or she or they has a defense and to prepare and submit it. The child, quote, requires the guiding hand of counsel at every step of the proceedings against them." In Rebuttal, the court recognized that children navigating the legal system require a guiding hand of support. Okay, a guiding hand. But Rebuttal was in the context of juvenile proceedings that were not immigration deportation proceedings. Do you see the hypocrisy here? Yet when the court decided the fate of non-citizen children's rights to counsel in the Supreme Court case of Reno, it downplayed the legal system's complexities, despite the fact that immigration proceedings are some of the most complex and complicated, even for attorneys like me. saying that children are, quote, not too young or too ignorant to exercise that right. As a result of these decisions, all children are entitled to legal representation for all civil delinquency cases that may result in juvenile detention under the Due Process Clause, while non-citizen children, unaccompanied minors, do not have the right to an attorney in immigration court. I know it makes no sense. I know it doesn't. And that's why we're here. I'm mad and I'm here. And there are so many other case studies in the context of minors where simply because they're pulled out of the immigration context, somehow they're afforded more rights, which makes no sense. It should be an equal playing field, in my opinion. When analyzing, for example, the rights of minors within the abortion context as well in Bellotti versus Baird, the Supreme Court stressed that because of the, quote, peculiar vulnerability of children and their inability to make critical decisions in an informed, mature manner, children must be treated differently from adults in a legal setting. Must be. As a child in their tender years under emotional stress may be ill-equipped to make a decision without mature advice and emotional support. As juvenile protections continued to evolve in the early 2000s, the court increasingly cited scientific data about brain development to bolster legal arguments. The court explained that developments in psychology and brain science continue to show fundamental differences between juvenile and adult minds. For example, parts of the brain involved in behavior control continue to mature throughout late adolescence. Using such logic, in Roper versus Simmons, the court abolished the death penalty for minors. The court cited similar sociological studies reporting that the comparative immaturity and irresponsibility of juveniles warrants treating juveniles differently in the eyes of the law until they reach 18. Comparing juvenile court to immigration court, those situations to unaccompanied minors, reveals the heightened disparities. And the way that we treat children is not fair. It's not fair in every context. It's not fair in every scenario, clearly. And it's vital to grasp the context around why the U.S. immigration system is so complex. I mean, not necessarily why it is, but just the fact that it is, to really demonstrate why legal counsel is so vital to these children. So vital. The ACLU has gone so far as to report a poll that showed 86% of American citizens would absolutely support policy which gave these children the right to an attorney, the right to appointed counsel in immigration deportation proceedings, regardless of the strength of their case, regardless of the ultimate outcome. Current policies are, however, unfortunately disconnected from common sense. It seems obvious that children should not have to face federal officers in court on their own. Quote, a child's age is far more than a chronological fact. It is a fact that generates common sense conclusions about behavior and perception. For example, an immigration attorney told a reporter about a trial where the judge asked if a crying baby could be taken out during the proceedings. The lawyer had to tell the judge that the infant was the respondent for the next case. The judge understandably assumed that the crying child was not needed in court, but on the contrary, the child's presence was required because they would be representing themselves momentarily, which it just turns your stomach. You don't have to be a mother, you don't have to be a parent to just have that just be the most nauseating image in your mind. The backward nature of immigration laws for unrepresented minors made this scenario a reality. It was not the judge. It was not even the federal officers. It was very much the politicians. It was very much the policy that is in place. Therefore, the right to counsel and additional juvenile protection should apply analogously to all children in the U.S. court system, regardless of citizenship status. And the people who know this so intimately are indeed the attorneys who are on the ground in this field already, who are the ones garnering support for better policy to support these children, to provide these unaccompanied children with counsel at the very least, and the lawyers who have done it themselves, who have been advocates for these children themselves, who have actually seen exactly the scenarios that I'm describing, and they fight every single day for the dignity and humanity of these children. And I am so blessed and grateful to have two attorneys today come on the podcast and talk about their experience. Thankfully, the Acacia Center for Justice has a whole lot of attorneys who do this work every day, and two of them are joining me on the podcast today to share their experience And to talk about this, I have Amanda Doroshow and Lauren Esterle from the Acacia Center for Justice. Amanda Doroshow is a program manager for the Unaccompanied Children's Program, UCP Attorney Recruitment Project, which is a national initiative to increase access to legal information and representation for unaccompanied children facing removal from the United States. Amanda originally served as a senior program associate for UCP at the Vera Institute for Justice. Prior to joining Vera, Amanda was an immigration attorney at Her Justice, where she trained and mentored pro bono attorneys and represented survivors of domestic violence pursuing immigration relief. Amanda started her career in the immigration field as an attorney at Empire Justice Center, where she represented residents in New York's Lower Hudson Valley pursuing both affirmative and defensive immigration relief. She also volunteered with the Daily Pro Bono Project on the Texas-Mexico border, assisting women and children seeking asylum. Let's hear from Amanda now.
There's this poem by Warson Shire called Home, and it's a heavy poem, but the first line starts out something along the lines of like, no one leaves home unless home is the mouth of a shark. And that really resonates with me because particularly for people seeking safety, people like seeking asylum, no one wants to leave their home. No one wants to leave their loved ones, their families, their food, their music, their culture, like what makes them who they are. People do that. People who are seeking safety do this because they have no other option. And people are going to do whatever they can to keep themselves and their loved ones safe. I know I would. And I think that is something that is not recognized, right? When you see in the media kind of this rhetoric painting people seeking asylum as breaking the law or criminals, it's something that's going to make our country less safe or like hurt people, when what it's failing to recognize is, one, the only way to apply for asylum is to show up in this country and request it. It's the legal, like they're doing it the legal way to do that. And then two, the backbone of our country depends on immigrants. Immigrants are like a huge reason of why we thrive as a country, and people aren't making that connection.
It's just insane to talk about it and to even have to try to convince people of this issue and of the fact that all children in the immigration system need an attorney.
I think it's really hard to talk about case numbers, particularly working with children, because it's not just a matter of like filling out a form, right? Or appearing one day in court. With all of these immigration cases, particularly with unaccompanied children, it requires a lot of time and dedication to build trust and rapport with the client so that you can really be able to advocate for them on their behalf. And that's a special set of skills that takes training, that takes time, that takes patience. I have this case that actually, I think this case was like 2014, maybe. I started this case and it still sticks with me.
Oh, wow.
I represented a 5-year-old little girl who was an unaccompanied child. She came from her home country with her grandmother fleeing violence. When they got to the border, they were actually separated. So the grandmother was detained in one place. The little girl was detained by herself. So that goes to show that family separation has been going on for a very long time prior to Trump's zero tolerance policy. And it continues to go on today.
Yep.
So then I ended up representing the little girl. The mother or the grandmother could not find an attorney. And I was very aware of her case and her asylum case because they were very similar. And she ended up being deported back to her home country. And throughout the whole time that I was representing this little girl, I think I was probably her attorney for about 5 years or so. The grandmother was in hiding, afraid for her life. And I just, wow. The whole time I knew, like, if she would have been able to get an attorney, she was detained in another state, was not even near me where I was in New York. I'm like, I think she would very likely be here today. Yep. Right. And then when I talk about kind of trauma-informed, child-friendly practices, I think one thing I really think about is kind of like how I navigated this with this experience with this little girl. I was like very acutely aware that being in this immigration system was traumatizing in itself. So for example, our first day when we went to court, I remember she threw up on the subway. She was so nervous. And I remember before us going in, we were sitting together and I was telling her, I was like, I am so proud of you. You are so brave. I'm with you every step of the way. Like, I'm here for you. The only reason that meant something to her is because we had been meeting for months and working together where she knows me and she trusts me. I didn't
Right.
just show up that day and say, hey, I'm here for you. And she's like, great. It was because we built that rapport. Another big thing was she loved to color. And so whenever we would meet, I would have her color, I would have her draw. I remember the day of her asylum interview, actually, her asylum interview was at 7 a.m. They lived 3.5 hours away. So they had to wake up in the middle of the night to get there for a 7 a.m. interview. You're not allowed food or water at the time in the asylum office. So she's scared, she's grumpy, she's hungry,
For
she's
a
thirsty,
child.
she's tired. For a 5-year-old.
Yeah, no snacks
5-year-old.
for a 5-year-old. Jesus.
Right. And I remember we're sitting in this interview and I just keep having her draw me pictures and color things for me because I could tell this was like an escape for her.
Mm-hmm.
And it was a way for her to relax and get out of this situation. So yes, I was there focusing on the immigration case and my arguments and how I was presenting the case to the asylum officer. But also a huge part of my job was focusing on her well-being and making sure that she was okay. And so that's another layer of working with children that I don't know if people necessarily realize. That's really important. Why it's really important to have attorneys. Every child have an attorney. Everybody in immigration proceedings to have an attorney, but also this holistic model that really meets the needs. And these attorneys have the training they need to provide child-centered, trauma-informed care.
There's a reason why we're a counselor first. You're an attorney second and a counselor first, always, because your clients, whether they be children or adults, are often only talking to you, only know you because they've had several of the worst days of their lives. It doesn't mean that they have to be the best attorney in the world, the smartest person, number one from, the top law school in the world. Someone who understands how this system works and has trauma-informed training, which obviously Acacia Center for Justice provides, is just pivotal. I hope wherever she is, she's doing okay.
I do too. I think it ended up being a really positive experience. She was granted asylum, got her green card. I still have her pictures. I think about her a lot, but I also want to flag that this case isn't unique. This isn't a special case. This was what my caseload was like.
Yep.
At Acacia, on our Unaccompanied Children program, we work with over 100 legal service providers, offices across the country. And we work with just some amazing advocates. And this is what they're doing day in and day out. Yeah. And it's amazing. One of the other things you said to me really made me think about kind of redefining success. This is something I wish I knew when I started practicing and what success looks like. Yes, it's great if you get, your client gets granted the relief that they were entitled to. And that's the outcome. In my case, my client ended up getting her green card. That's wonderful, but I think that's not what success means. Actually, redefining success to really looking at the value of having an advocate throughout the process of this time to try to bring some dignity and respect to a system that is designed to do the opposite. And so when I look at success of my client, yes, I am happy. I hope she's thriving. I think of her often, but I think of what success was how we navigated our court date together, how we navigated that asylum interview together and all the pictures that she drew me and how she was laughing when we left the asylum interview because I had her draw a picture of something funny, right? To me, that is also where success should be measured. And it's not about the result, but it's about redefining the value of having an advocate by someone's side throughout every step of the way. And that you can't put a number on that. That's just really, really valuable.
You're going to make me cry. Thanks. Appreciate that. Oh my God.
So my calling to this work has really come through my family history. My mom, she came to the U.S. from Cuba at the age of 13 by herself. And so if she were to have come today, she would have been designated as an unaccompanied child. She would have been expected, she would have been detained in the Office of Refugee Resettlement Custody. She would have been expected to defend herself in an immigration court by herself if she didn't find her own attorney. And so that was really something that's motivated me. And then even prior to that, my family history is rooted in migrating and immigrating. My grandparents fled Poland from the Holocaust seeking safety. And then even before that, my great-grandparents fled religious persecution in Russia. And so it's just been really ingrained to me, these opportunities and privileges I have by luck of being born here in this country are a result of the risks that my family has taken through generations. And that's what really motivated me to dedicate my career to this work.
Exactly. And people don't understand that the line between us, someone who was born here and someone who has to make those journeys and those treks as unaccompanied children or just adults, right? The struggles do not get any lesser just because you're 18 and up. It's still equally as challenging, but the line between us and them is thinner than people might think. And the things that we have to relate to those people and that just the empathy across borders, I think, is lost in translation with so many people, especially in our country, because it's very easy to see unaccompanied children and immigrants as these faceless people who are just coming into our country without a goal or a reason or a background, and it's never ever been like that from the time of the Holocaust, before then and beyond. So I think it's great that you intimately understood that from day zero, which is incredible. What was your very first job in this space?
Yeah, my very first job. Well, even before that, in law school, I did an immigration clinic. That
counts.
Really
I count
eye-opening.
that.
Yeah.
My law students interning counts. Okay, I count that as a
Yes.
job. It's on your resume. It counts.
Yes, and it was really, really eye-opening to me. I had a client that was a survivor of domestic violence, two clients actually, and it just became really clear to me of like the importance of an attorney to navigate this system. Like, I learned very quickly that the immigration system is flawed by design, and it's intended to exclude people. There's a lack of dignity in this system, and it doesn't have humanity in mind and like the needs of the people navigating the system in mind. And so even as a law student, when I started in my immigration clinic, that was quickly the thing that I saw. And the fact that my clients had an attorney, was a huge, it almost was like my client had won the lottery because she had an attorney and a pro bono attorney, because there weren't enough attorneys to meet the needs. And the results of someone's immigration case can have really, really dire consequences for themselves, for their families, for generations. Yeah.
Right. And do you think that having an attorney is, I guess, do you think that the amount of people who don't have an attorney in our system specifically is due mostly in part to the fact that there are so many cases and not enough attorneys? Or is it, like you said, kind of built by design, where some people just aren't provided the resources that may or may not be at their fingertips because again, humanity wasn't in mind and helpfulness wasn't in mind? What is your take on that?
It's a really good question. I think there's a little bit of everything there. I think immigration cases take a very long time to process, can be years, right? There's cases that I was working on at prior jobs 6 years ago that still aren't resolved, right? So they can take a very long time. And there's also not enough attorneys doing this work. So if you combine both things, right, long caseloads build up really, really quickly, in conjunction with the drought of immigration attorneys. We also have that in mind. I think when I'm talking about the immigration legal system and I say like it's really not designed with humanity in mind, I think the issue, or what a main issue is, it's an outdated framework, right? Our current immigration system that doesn't take into account migration needs, why people flee violence, why people seek safety. It doesn't take account into any of that. And a part of what we need is meaningful congressional immigration reform, and not just reform to say, reform, but reform that centers humanity and the needs of the people and their families navigating the immigration system.
Right. And The same way that any area of law is inherently outdated, I feel like that comment is applicable everywhere, right? A lot of areas of law, the legal system is always catching up to, whether it be technology or progressiveness or just social movements. What we want to see from our courts, from our system, from our laws, it takes decades for anyone to catch up. I mean, to AI alone, it's going to be another 50 years before we have anything figured out, and by then it's going to be already outdated, or there's going to be something new to catch up with. So with respect to immigration reform, what do you feel are the differences between, the immigration policy that we have, or the system we have that worked 50 years ago that now doesn't work anymore?
You kind of just mentioned this, but like, unless in your family history is indigenous to this land, or your family was brought here through the travesty of slavery, at some point there is an migrant story in your history. And, if you're able, for those that don't know it, if you're able to ask people questions and find that out, I really urge people to, because first, it's comparing apples to oranges, how maybe a great grandparent came through Ellis Island versus the system that's today. People now are navigating a system designated for exclusion right now and deportation. And that wasn't the case generations ago. Even though the systems are very different, been outdated for a very long time, there is some common ground through kind of history, generational immigration history. And that's kind of, when I think about it, like the motivations of why people migrate and why people immigrate. It's for opportunity for themselves or their family. It's to seek safety. These are all really brave, admirable things that I think many people, if they look at their family histories, will be able to find these key aspects and be able to relate to that. And I think that should be really the guiding factors when we're talking about immigration, the rhetoric used in the media, the rhetoric used by politicians on both sides of the spectrum, when we're informing our laws and regulations and our policies. That's what we should be thinking about. And the humanity should kind of be the guiding principle. We should be welcoming people with dignity, with respect, with care, not shutting the door in their face.
Right. And I think, most people can identify with that. Like you said, my family came over from Poland, and I found I think it was my, one of the great grandmother's name on a list in Ellis Island, and it's when you tell people about that, oh wow, she wrote her name down and she changed her last name to be shorter so that it, she would be able to blend in. It wouldn't be so, 7 consonants in a row Polish, da 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 da. It's admirable and it's cool and it's interesting and it's a story of bravery and struggle, and also just the courage to be able to start somewhere new. And then suddenly, when the lens shifts to a time when we have cell phones and iPhones, and we can actually quite literally see before our eyes in real time the war that's going on, that people are fleeing, the struggles and the violence. The amount of information that any of us have access to at our fingertips is honestly insanity, and it makes most of us go insane. People are coming here with fantastic, admirable goals in mind, and our country is a country of immigrants. Period. Dead stop. Full stop. And we would be nothing without policy that favors inclusion as opposed to exclusion. The reason why the Unaccompanied Children's Program exists is because there are glaring gaps that we need to fill.
It's really complex. It's really nuanced. There's a huge power imbalance to presume that a child should be able to represent themselves in immigration court. Like, let me paint a picture for you here, actually. Imagine a 3-year-old in immigration court who couldn't find their own attorney, so they're representing themselves. What that means is we're expecting them to make complex legal and constitutional arguments to persuade a judge to stay here in the U.S., to be granted relief that they may be entitled to and qualify for. We're expecting them to be experts in the law. That's a huge power imbalance, right? That's stark to me if you see that. That is not child-centered. That's not person-centered at all. But I think the way to try to combat this power imbalance and combat this inequity and try to preserve a child or a respondent in immigration proceedings, like preserve their due process rights, is for someone to have an attorney. And it's not just an attorney, it's a zealous advocate that is trained in immigration law, that knows how to present their case to the court, right? And particularly when we're talking about unaccompanied children, the holistic needs of a child is really essential. A child isn't just their immigration case. They've been through a lot, many times have fled serious like trauma in their home country, the trauma of coming to this country, the trauma of being detained, the trauma of navigating the immigration system, and there's layers to their life. So having a holistic team that would include maybe a social worker or a caseworker or a therapist to also support the child throughout their case, I think is really essential. And it's not for just a point in time in a case, it's for the entirety of the case from beginning to end, which can take years and years and years. Yeah.
What's your elevator pitch for lawyers, attorneys of any age who are looking to get into this field, or law students who I know are on the other side of my screen always, and in my emails and DMs always, asking about opportunities and internships, and who have expressed interest in getting involved with Acacia and their work with unaccompanied children? What do you have to say to those people?
What I would say to those people out there that are like listening, they're not sure, is like, okay, yes, this is hard work. I'm not going to deny that. And it's really important to center your self-preservation and your self-care to have like a really long lasting career in this field. But it's essential work. It's crucial work. And it can really, really be rewarding because you can really profoundly impact people in different ways. This is hard. It is, but you're not alone doing this work. There is a groundswell of attorneys and advocates across the country. At Acacia, we work with them and they are amazing, and they have dedicated their lives to combating and fighting against the inequities in this system. And you join that groundswell of attorneys and advocates, and it's a really supportive community. And so for your law students out there, there's an amazing fellowship opportunity through Immigrant Justice Corps. It's a 2-year fully paid fellowship program. And the applications are actually currently open right now for their September 2025 cohort. Connect with us and see about our network of providers that we work with. They have different job openings or opportunities. You can go to our website, and on our careers page, you can sign up for an email list where you can get email blasts of like, what's the latest of what's going on? What are we doing at Acacia? But also what are some of the job openings at our providers that we work with, at our partners.
I love that. I'm going to add all of those links that she mentioned in the episode bio so that everyone can click it easily as they're listening. Thank you. Well, have a great rest of your day. I also have with me Lauren Esterle. She is the Associate Program Director for the Unaccompanied Children Program's Attorney Recruitment Project with the Acacia Center for Justice. She originally served as a program manager for UCP at the Vera Institute of Justice. Prior to joining Vera, she worked with 2 Los Angeles-based nonprofits providing removal defense to children and adults in immigration proceedings before transitioning to actually firsthand adjudicating asylum claims with the USCIS Los Angeles Asylum Office. Here is Lauren.
I think one of the phrases that always stuck with me is I think it was an immigration judge who said that immigration court is like having a death penalty case in traffic court, which I think just perfectly highlights the stakes are so high in these cases. This is the outcomes of these cases are going to completely impact somebody's future. And yet we have them happen in courts that do not look anything like our criminal legal system, where, we're used to this idea of innocent until proven guilty, and that the party with the power is the one who actually has to prove that somebody is guilty, right? And in immigration court, it's kind of the exact opposite, where you have to actually establish that you meet these very rigid standards for relief. And so it's almost the party without the power that is then needing to actually present the case. And so it's just kind of bonkers when you think about it.
What made you want to become involved in this specific area of law? Was it something that happened during law school? Was it kind of always in your mind, or did you just kind of get shoved in that direction by fate or a colleague or otherwise?
Yeah. No, that's a great question. So I think I was one of those people who went to law school not really knowing what I wanted to do. I had this vague interest in international human rights law, public interest law. but then didn't really know where specifically that would take me. And had like the privilege during law school of working in a clinic that specifically represented asylum seekers. And so had the opportunity to work with a colleague to represent a woman who was detained in ICE custody, who was seeking asylum. And that was a pretty eye-opening experience. Prior to that, I admittedly did not really know much about our immigration system, didn't know much about immigration detention, and was pretty horrified to see how those work and to see the harmful ways that they really impact those who are caught up in that system. And so it was both like a very infuriating process, seeing kind of the way that she was treated, both in immigration detention and just like the hoops that we had to go through in order to have a grant of asylum in what, to me felt like an extremely strong case. And so I think it was just like really infuriating and kind of lit a fire in my belly to be like, okay, I want to keep working in this area. And at the same time, I was amazed by her resiliency, her like hope in the future, and like still desire to be part of American society and like commitment to this country. And so that also was like such a privilege just to be inspired by her and have like her hope kind of infuse me. So I think it was both of those aspects, kind of like the anger and desire to see how we can like mitigate harms within this system, and also just like the absolute privilege and rewarding nature of the work of working with clients who are caught up in it. So that kind of like propelled me forward. And then just one thing kind of led to another after law school. And I was able to work in direct services at a few different nonprofits representing both adults and unaccompanied children in immigration court. I also worked for a brief period of time as an adjudicator with USCIS, adjudicating asylum claims. And then I have had the privilege of working in more like program management roles around the immigration field for the past few years. And now at Acacia, working to expand representation for unaccompanied children. So it's kind of been like a long meandering path, a few different kind of areas in immigration law, but all really connected. And I think kind of the thread that I've seen through all of it is just like how important it is to have representation in immigration court through these proceedings, while we are also working at a much larger scale to like reimagine and reform the immigration system. And so that's what's exciting about the current role that I'm in, is that we're really like trying to hit that day where there's what we refer to as universal representation in immigration court, where every person has the right to appointed counsel in immigration court. Because unlike the criminal legal system, that is not currently how our system is set up.
And to most people, it sounds crazy to be fighting for something that even to the layperson is a no-brainer. It's of course a no-brainer. It's the same way that I can talk in circles about why every criminal defendant deserves the right to counsel representation, but people stare at you and go, yeah, they do and they have. That's why we have the amendment for that. Why is immigration court any different? And you have to say, and get into exactly why. For whatever reason, our courts and our legislators do not treat it the same. And it does very much sound like a calling for you specifically, and for everyone else that I've spoken to in this field. It whether they stumbled upon it, whether they always wanted to be in this area, it's been rewarding for both sides, of course, even though it can be very draining and devastating to see how the system is. Changing lives every single day just by being there is beautiful. So thank you for that,
Thank
Lauren.
you. And yeah, such passionate, amazing advocates in this field. And I think what's so great about it is that there's so many different facets and ways that we can work to reimagine and reform the system and mitigate harm while doing it. And it's a pleasure to be part of such a large community that is working towards that right now. And completely agree that like I've had so many conversations over the years where people are like, wait, you don't have appointed counsel in immigration court. Like, how does that work and why? And then, yeah, as you mentioned, you were like, well, it's a civil proceeding, not a criminal legal proceeding. And then like, that just.
Despite the fact the consequences are
Yes.
dire and, deportation and potential, exposure and risk to more violence in their home country, the reason why they left in the first place.
Totally.
It should be outcome
Right.
oriented, but can you expand a little bit more on what adjudicating asylum cases means and what your role was in that?
Yeah, definitely. So there's a few different tracks of ways that people can seek asylum in the United States. So via both tracks, you have to be physically present in the United States to seek asylum. I think that's actually something that not everyone always recognizes. So when we talk about like asylum seekers who are coming to the border to seek entry and asylum in the United States, like that is the correct pathway to do that. And it's kind of like the only pathway to do that if you are wanting to seek asylum and not currently in the United States. And so folks who present themselves at the border seeking asylum are generally put into what is called like defensive asylum proceedings, and you would go in front of an immigration judge generally to seek asylum. If you are already in the United States and not in removal proceedings, so let's say maybe you entered on a tourist visa, or you entered the United States and were not put into removal proceedings, you can seek asylum from USCIS. It's technically called an affirmative process because it's supposed to be set up to be a little less adversarial. And that's also the avenue that unaccompanied children are able to first pursue asylum, regardless if they're in removal proceedings or not. That is one of the protections that is afforded to them through the TVPRA, a form of legislation that was passed. But so in that instance, rather than being in a court setting to seek asylum, you are presenting your case before what's called an asylum officer. So it's not adversarial. There's no entity representing the government's interests like there is an immigration court. So it's like a more informal interview with an adjudicator. And so it's pretty remarkable still, the expectations that we have of people in these instances. So they're usually typically like a 2 to 3 hour interview where the asylum officer is talking with the person for the first time. This is the very first time they've met. And trying to establish the reasons why the person came to the United States and is seeking asylum. And, it has to fit into, unfortunately, a very narrow box. So our asylum rules and regulations were created after World War II. And a lot of them have not been updated. And so the way that it was scoped very much matched, I think, the folks who were seeking safety at that time. And while those are still like very typical grounds for seeking asylum, so religion, political opinion, race, ethnicity, there are like the reasons have very much expanded. And so folks who are seeking safety from climate change, from strife in home country that's not related to one of those grounds. And so there's a fifth group that you can kind of work to show that you're part of to get a grant of asylum, which is membership in a particular social group. It's kind of like this catch-all phrase. That's where a lot of like movement over the past few years has taken place to kind of see what fits there.
Can you just give an example of exactly what an unaccompanied child would experience? Exactly where do they go from point A to point B? How long does it take for them to see anyone who is actually their advocate, quote unquote, right? Like we've seen the photos of the kids, in the reenactments in court. How did they get there, right? Where are they staying? Are they in cells together? Are they in, some kind of housing facility? How does it exactly work step by step?
Yeah, that's a great question. So If we're taking the example of like an unaccompanied child who's presenting themselves at the border, they would present themselves to like a Customs and Border Patrol officer who is going to ask them kind of like basic biographical information and a little bit about like the reason why they're there. If the child is under 18, they don't have immigration status and they are without a parent or legal guardian in that moment, they are designated an unaccompanied child. And what happens is that they are typically placed into custody, but they are only allowed to be there. So these are often, if you remember seeing the photos of like what was referred to as like the hieleras, so like the really cold ice boxes where lots of people are stuffed in and they have like the emergency blankets, like kind of picturing those types of locations. So they'll be placed in those, but unaccompanied children are supposed to only be held in those for up to 72 hours. And then they are actually transferred to the care and custody of the Office of Refugee Resettlement, where they are placed into a shelter while they wait reunification to a family member or a vetted sponsor. And these shelters can look very different. Some of them might be like smaller group home settings. Some of them might be very large still intake centers where there's hundreds of children present. It kind of just depends which one the youth gets placed at. And then while in the care and custody of the Office of Refugee Resettlement, there's like two different processes that kind of simultaneously start. So there's a reunification process where ORR is working to reunite the child with a family member or a vetted sponsor. And then there is also the removal proceedings. So because these children don't have any immigration status, they are put into removal or deportation proceedings. And so depending on how long a child remains in ORR custody, they may or may not move forward with their immigration case while detained, or they may be released and reunified to a sponsor and then continue that removal or deportation case when they're in the community. Currently, the youth do meet with attorneys for a Know Your Rights presentation and a legal screening while they are in ORR custody. That is kind of like a baseline access to legal services that all unaccompanied children should be receiving. So a general overview of the immigration system, the different forms of immigration relief that they might qualify for.
And mind you, these children could be 5, 6, 7, 8 years old.
So 0 to 18.
What law students are taught.
Completely. And it's like just a very basic introductory overview.
Cross off a box and send them on their way. It's not going to actually help them navigate the very complex immigration system.
It is no way a substitute for representation for an attorney. Yes, exactly.
What surprised you the most about just this field, the people that you worked with, the system? I know you mentioned in the beginning that it was, even though you knew how much the system needed reform, it still surprised you the lack of humanity with which your client was treated with, and the way that she was treated by us, by our country in detainment. Can you just expand on that, or just on other ways in which it really made you take a step back and go, wow, I wish everyone knew about this?
The origins of our current immigration system are based in racism and exclusion. So if we're talking about the 1790 Naturalization Act, which said that only free white people who'd been in the United States for 2 years could be citizens. Or if we're talking about fugitive slave laws or Indian removal acts, these are all laws that were focused around the policing and enforcement of certain peoples in the United States.
The Chinese Exclusion Act.
The Chinese Exclusion Act.
Yeah,
yes,
I'm like, no, we continued to be racist, loud and racist always throughout not that long ago. The pictures might have been in black and white, but the people people who experienced that firsthand are still very much alive and well today.
Yeah, and it continues today. So in the 1900s we had quota laws, which depending on what country you were from, there was only a certain amount of people that could come, and the number of people from countries is very different depending on which country we're talking about, right? And then I think we've even seen it more recently in terms of like the way that we responded to, for example, like Ukrainian asylum seekers who came to our border seeking entry and safety versus Haitian asylum seekers. And so I think what's really important is that to understand that like this is the basis that our system is currently operating off of. And that's like the status quo of how the system is in motion, right? It is a complex system, but it is in motion, and it's in motion using these types of underlying justifications for the ways that it is set up. Really important to understand that in order to kind of address the system head on and be able to kind of think about how we want to reform it. How can we really actually like center the experiences of immigrants who are coming to the United States? How can we center their humanity? How can we make the system uphold like our values of freedom and justice and dignity and due process, right? Like how can we reimagine and make sure that we are actually achieving the ends that we say we are trying to work towards?
Clearly, even in the actual court system and the immigration system, and I'm sure in ICE, they are treated differently based upon what their skin color is, which is horrifying. And I don't think people understand the impact of how horrifying that is when the laws are supposed to apply equally to everyone, and our values as a country are supposed to benefit equally everyone.
Completely. And you see that in like the way, like the language that is used if we're talking about like folks who are coming from the southern border versus the northern border. It's just like all these different ways that dehumanizing language is so harmful, and it permeates like so much of the political discourse in this area as well. And then, as you mentioned, like America is a country of immigrants, unless you were indigenous or your family was brought here through the forced slave trade. So a lot of people do have an immigration story. My grandfather came through Ellis Island when I think he was 4 years old. As far as I know, he showed up and was allowed into, just allowed in. And you compare that to the experience that like an unaccompanied child has today who is seeking asylum or seeking entry, and particularly at the southern border. And it's so different. It's so stark. And I think that speaks for itself. Why, just to bring it back, it's so important that we work to get representation and access to justice and freedom for all the folks who are impacted by the immigration system, either in immigration removal proceedings or facing deportation. Migration is a natural phenomenon, right? Migration has been happening for forever. Migration is going to continue to happen for forever. So also just like centering this idea of like, this is a very natural, normal phenomenon. It's not always that these children are actually making this journey by themselves. So sometimes, yes, like unaccompanied children are making the journey and presenting themselves at the United States border completely by themselves. Or it's that they've made this a journey with family members and are actually separated, either, physically at the border by, for example, our past zero tolerance policies under Trump, where parents were physically separated from their children, but also it can be in instances, for example, like the Remain in Mexico policy, where like families had to wait in Mexico while they were seeking asylum and entry here into the United States. And the situation became so dire and dangerous in many of those locations where families were meant to wait, that families had to make this really difficult decision of maybe it was safer and in the child's best interest to actually come and present themselves on their own at the border. And so it's not like physical family separation, but it is a policy that is resulting in family separation. And similarly, you're designated an unaccompanied child if you present yourself without a parent or legal guardian. So also a lot of times children are coming maybe with an aunt or an uncle, an older sibling. And because those people are not designated their parent or legal guardian, they're then separated from them at the border and go through different proceedings as well. So the latest data came out from the last fiscal year that about only 53% of unaccompanied children had representation for their actual immigration proceedings. And so in many ways, it's kind of just like how lucky you are if you're trying to find. So if you are in the office, like if you still remain in OR custody during your immigration proceedings, you actually will have access to a counsel. But if you're in the community, it's almost the burden is on the youth to go find their representation. And at that point, it becomes almost luck of the draw in terms if you're able to find a pro bono attorney or a low bono attorney who's able to represent you in your immigration proceedings. And we know that having an attorney at some point in your case makes a huge difference. So a study has shown that it makes it 7 times more likely that an unaccompanied child will have an end result in their case that allows them to remain in the United States if they have representation. That's huge.
Right, because it's not. I mean, people think, oh well, people are, these children or even people, adults are deported because they don't have a strong enough case. It actually has nothing to do with that, unfortunately. Most of the time, from everything I've seen, from everything I've read, from the just raw statistics that you can't counter, it's no, they had a lawyer who was able to stand next to them and know how to navigate and know what to say and know what facts were relevant and could, speak the language of the people who were charged with enforcing the quote unquote asylum laws and ultimately sign the paper to deport
Completely.
them. And of course there are a bunch of reasons why so many unaccompanied children specifically do not have attorneys. But one really big factor that Acacia definitely is trying to combat and raise awareness about is the lack of attorneys that are actually in this space that either know about the need or are available to satisfy the need.
This is such crucial work. It's such rewarding work. It is also really hard work. But we just really want to encourage anybody who is interested in this. Like this is defense work. I don't think it's always been thought of that way, but this is like defense work. It is representing people's due process rights. It is fighting against a system that is completely unjust and who's like
stacked against them.
The
period.
End result that the system is trying to achieve is to end in this person's deportation. And so this is such meaningful, such crucial, such urgently needed work. And it's just such a privilege to work in this field and get to meet folks from all these different cultures. It's just such a privilege also to work with these clients. I just really encourage anybody who is interested. There is a huge need, and we're really actively working to make it so that this is a career field that is going to be sustainable. I think you oftentimes hear about indirect services, and I think this applies across, not just in the immigration space, but lots of different direct services spaces that because you are operating in a system that requires clients to share instances of trauma constantly and actively causes re-traumatization, you're also exposed to that as an advocate. And so what we're really looking to do is to figure out ways and build infrastructure to support attorneys to make sure that they're doing this crucial work in a way that is going to still allow them to thrive and succeed and be healthy and happy. I think that is being centered really actively at many organizations right now. And it's really exciting that there's awareness around that. And so I think it's a really great time to get into this field. And there's really wonderful opportunities for law students. We've been partnering with Immigrant Justice Corps, or IJC. They're a wonderful fellowship organization who runs a 2-year fellowship program for recent law school graduates, where you, along with a cohort of all these other fellows, are going through the first 2 years, of your career together. And so it's really, you get to learn and receive a lot of mentorship and support, not only from IJC, but from your fellows. It builds this really strong and beautiful community. So I wish that I had been able to be part of that when I first started. I think that's a wonderful opportunity. And then we're currently partnering with over 100 different nonprofit offices across the country that do really amazing direct services work under our Unaccompanied Children program. And they're constantly expanding their teams and hiring. And so if folks are interested, I encourage them to check out our career page on our website. It actually has a map so you can see which nonprofits maybe are located in the areas you want to work in, and check out what postings they have. But so that was a little bit more about how to get involved, but also just it's just such rewarding and crucial work that I really encourage folks who are interested to check it out.
All of the links and initiatives that Amanda and Lauren mentioned during their interviews will be provided in the show notes of this episode, as well as the Acacia Center for Justice's links to pursue fellowships with their organization, because again, it cannot be stressed enough how vital it is for more law students and attorneys to enter this field and to be interested and to lend a helping hand in an area, in a field, in a system that, although yes, needs severe, very, very groundbreaking reform, in the meantime, before then, we need bodies, we need lawyers, we need people there, because there just aren't enough right now. And this work is so important. It is so vital. It is genuinely life-saving. And I am just so grateful to have you guys and an audience to be able to share their stories and the stories of their clients and the stories of the children I spoke about today, to continue to fight and to continue to raise awareness and to continue to highlight these issues until one day I can finally come on here and say, hey, guess who has the right to an attorney in immigration proceedings and deportation proceedings? Unaccompanied minors, unaccompanied children. Thank God. We are a country of immigrants. We are a society of immigrants, proudly. And I just cannot thank Lauren and Amanda and the Acacia Center for Justice enough for making this episode a reality. My rebuttal for today's episode is a no-brainer. Children under the age of 18 should not have to represent themselves in court. They should have the right to counsel. Period. Point blank. But who am I? Whomst am I, right? I'm somebody. Enough for y'all to listen to me. Thank goodness, and hopefully spread the word in your own communities. And if you're an attorney or a law student, get involved. It's great. It's an incredible organization. Acacia Center for Justice really is. And you can contact even Amanda and Lauren to learn more. Their information will be in the show notes. I am so blessed and honored. Love you. Thank you for being here and listening. Follow me everywhere. Rebuttal Pod, Reb Maisel on TikTok, on Instagram, on Twitter. And continue to fight the fight. Fight the good fight with me, with Acacia, with Amanda, with Lauren, and for every initiative that brings dignity and humanity to the immigration system. See you guys next time.